Okay, welcome to Operation Diversification. And this is an adaptive grazing webinar on Providence Farm. I'm here as project coordinator, Christina Krobakova, and Martha is here in the background.
Hi.
Farmer Martha. And we have a farm in the background here, and we are welcoming Russ Wilson from Wilson Cattle. And we're very, very grateful to have this opportunity to share what we're learning with Russ. That would not have been possible without Northern Organic Farming Association of New Jersey. Devin Cornea and the crew really pulled a rabbit out of a hat. We were denied funding on some other grants, and he appealed to the Highlands Council because he believed this is essential to small farms to learn how to restore land with animals and with other means. And luckily the Highlands Council agreed. And so we had this funding available to make these opportunities available to anyone who is interested in learning about land restoration, especially the small farm context as New Jersey is and as Pennsylvania, a much larger state. Russ is familiar with New Jersey's challenges. And of course, he's going to share with you today some of the challenges he had in Pennsylvania. So welcome, Russ Wilson. We're so happy to have you.
Well, thanks for having me. It's really an honor to be able to do a webinar for you guys tonight, and then 7 days we'll be back on the farm and walking the farm. I have a lot of slides here for you tonight. I don't think we're going to get through them all. Hopefully not. Honestly, I'd rather answer questions. So we're going to try and present for like 45 minutes, and then we'll have like 45 minutes of Q&A. I do recognize a lot of names. So I've met some of you before, and I've seen you before. So the beginning part of the presentation, you guys have all seen my presentations, or the ones you have seen, is going to be a little bit redundant, but I think it's necessary for the folks that have not seen anything that I've done yet. So I guess we can go ahead and share screen. If you have any questions, is there a chat someplace, Christina?
Yep. Yeah, they can put the questions in the chat. If something comes to mind right through the presentation, we ask that you would put it in the chat and hold the question. And then we'll get to it because we do plan on having, at least a half hour, if not 45-minute Q&A after.
And yeah, most definitely. If you have any questions, type it in the chat. That way it's not forgotten. And if Christina sees that we need to stop and answer that question, I'm more than happy to do that, because there's some terms and whatnot that, some of us just don't know. So, and, if that's going to help down the road, then, we need to stop and answer those questions. So I'm going to go ahead and share screen here and get started.
Yeah, and I'll ask everybody to mute your phones. Yep, so we got just the focus on the presentation. Thank you.
And everybody able to see that okay? Okay, I'm from Wilson Land and Cattle Company. I'm in northwestern Pennsylvania. The weather's very, very similar here as it is where Martha is at Providence Farm. Oh boy. Let's see. Okay. This here is a video from, hopefully we can play it. Hopefully it doesn't lag too bad for you. This is a video from last January, towards the end of January. We were able to keep the cows out over, it's like 320 some days, something like that. We fed hay for 47 days. You can see here there's a calf nursing on its mom. Most generally, the typical farm would have those calves weaned, but we leave the calves with the cows longer, and we do the same thing with our sheep. I think that it makes a better animal in the long run if we're able to leave them with their moms. Their moms teach them a lot. This here's the 30-second overview of the farm. There's sheep right here, windbreaks here. And then the cows will be over here. And you can see right here in this field, there's a yellow spot that I haven't pointed out before. That is a different soil type, so it doesn't do as that part of the field does not do as well as other parts. This here's the infrastructure on my farm. We have a lot of infrastructure. Is it necessary to have all this infrastructure? I don't think so. For a new farmer to go out and put all this infrastructure on their farm, it's almost going to be impossible unless you're able to get grant money or something to that nature. So my recommendation for the beginning farmer is put a perimeter fence up and put water lines on above the ground. Now all my water lines are below ground. We went 3 years with water lines above ground. We have 40 some frost-free hydrants now that I put in by myself. They can be a little bit expensive if you have somebody do it for you, but if you do it yourself, you're only looking at, maybe $150 to $200 for one hydrant to put in. So when you compare that to the cost of some of these other watering points, they're relatively inexpensive. And then this is my lease property. I just have a fence around it, and then I either haul water or I pump water out of the creek down below here. The managed livestock on my farm, and it used to be all about the cows, and that's the only thing we had on the farm for the first 3 or 4 years. It was all about the cows, pushing the cows, trying to get them to gain weight, trying to keep them bred. And the vet was on the farm a lot because we just had nothing but sickness. And whenever we started focusing on the soil, like our earthworms, our dung beetles, we have 3 different species of dung beetles on the farm now. And your microbes, when we started focusing all on this stuff here, we we're able to have these animals down here. Before we couldn't hardly sustain the animals that we had. And we're going to talk about that here in a little bit. 2011, 2012, you can move this out of the way here. 2011, 2012 was 2012 is where Christina and Martha and I were talking about this earlier. Is the first year that we started rotational grazing. And the gentleman that came in and introduced me to rotational grazing, he suggested that I move the cows once a day. And quite frankly, I didn't have that mindset. And it was really, really hard for me to wrap my mind around it. That's just a crazy idea to move cows once a day. It just didn't make sense back then. Now it actually makes sense to move them more often. You can get huge benefits the more you move them. And you can see here as we go through the years, here, up to 10 times a day in 2015. We've moved them as many as 13 times in one day. And that was typically just because of wet soils. But our 10-year average outgrazing, the animals, livestock outgrazing with no supplements other than salt or trace mineral salt, is 309 grazing days. And for me, it cost me $150 a day to feed my animals. So it's advantageous for me to keep them out, even if it's 10 days, 150, 10 days, that's $1,500 it's costing me to feed those animals. So just as little as 10 days, that's a huge deal. We could only sustain 45 animal units, and now we can easily sustain 90 animal units. Our animal unit numbers are a little bit low this year, and it shows on our pastures as well. I think there's around 25 acres here on my farm that we haven't grazed yet, so we just set it back for stockpile. In 2011, 3,500 gallons of diesel fuel, plastic, fertilizer, and 45 animal units. The farm was going out of business. I had to do something. So that's why in 2012, that was our first year. Actually, late 2011 is when we actually started rotational grazing. And we were on a 7 to 14 day rotation. And that's what I thought rotational grazing was. And it really wasn't. Those fields that I had 14-day rotation on, I have still have cow trails in them from the cows walking back to water. I can still show you those cow trails today. In 2016 and from 2016 forward, we purchase around 200 gallons of diesel fuel for the farm. Sometimes it's a little bit more, depends on. We also have around 90 acres, 70 to 90 acres of woodlands. So running a tractor and stuff on to pull wood out and manage those woods, sometimes I use a little bit more diesel fuel. But for the most part, for the livestock and the open land, we're looking at 200 gallons of diesel fuel. So at the price of diesel fuel today, I know the prices are going down, but they were really high there for a while. 3,500 gallons of diesel fuel and 200 gallons of diesel fuel, that's a huge savings right there. My sole income is, or with the exception of speaking and stuff now, but my sole income for the farm comes from the farm. My wife doesn't work off the farm. I don't work off the farm. So, that's there's a lot to be said for that, because there's so many farms that unfortunately somebody has to work off the farm to help support the farm. So I've done a lot of research and studying and trying to get this figured out. Cow-calf operation inputs. And now this goes forward to all other types of livestock operations. Your stored feed cost is the most expensive input that you have on the farm. So for me, whenever I first seen that, there was a light bulb that went off, and it's like, how do I get rid of the stored feed cost? We graze longer into the year. So if we get rid of the stored feed costs, and then second is depreciation costs, and that would be all the equipment you have. If you're making hay or planting a lot of stuff or whatever, you have a lot of depreciation cost on your equipment. For the most part, we have these things that we call needs and wants, and most of the time when it comes to the equipment, we want the equipment versus really needing it. Do we really need that extra big tractor? Do we really need that hay baler? So we quit making hay, and when we've purchased our hay, since I guess it's been about 10 years that we've been buying our hay. And we've done very, very well with it. And I have two kids. I have a daughter. This here's when she was little. She was out to Providence, the first pasture walk we did. She's not going to be able to make it this trip. She's got too much school work she's got to get done. But I just like to show, everybody. I used to get zapped with a lot of folks, and not so much anymore, but I used to get zapped with a lot of folks. How do you move all that fence? Well, here's a 4-year-old that helped me move the cows at least once a day. by golly, if a four-year-old can move cows, um, the average farmer should be able to move cows.
It takes
But
its,
that
right, Russ?
this here, yes,
Ask for help. That's the theme here.
yeah, yeah. Don't be afraid to ask for help. My daughter, you know, everybody has. We are talking about this earlier as well. Everybody has their strong points for the farm, and one of the things, my daughter, she can walk into a flock of sheep, she can walk into the herd of cows, and she can tell you if there's a sick one in the bunch. I mean, she's that good. She knows all the animals. She has names for all her sheep, and she takes care of her sheep. I seen the sheep for the first time here about 3 or 4 days ago when I was helping her moving them across the farm. So, she takes care of those sheep. My son takes care of our hogs. Um, Forage diversity. The diversity is key for most all farms that are trying to be regenerative. The more diversity you have, you're going to have a longer, forage diversity, a longer grazing window, higher forage production, better balance and ration for the whole system. That includes your microbes to your livestock that you're going to harvest, plant persistence, and of course, we want to improve that soil health. A lot of farms have been beat up pretty hard here. Providence was one of them that was beat up pretty good. I was able to visit about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and if you're coming to the field day here in a week, you're going to see a huge difference. Just that very short period of time, you're going to see a huge improvement in forage diversity and plant production. So, you know, integration of diverse uh, crop types, cool season perennials. That's what most all farms are working with. Uh, like orchard grass, perennial ryegrass, brome grass, the cool season grasses, and then of course, you're going to have your legumes uh, that's typically in that. But we have this huge push in the spring, spring flush, and then in the summertime, August, September, it doesn't really want to grow very well. And then we have right now is our next huge push in our cool season perennials. And I'm sure that a lot of you have seen this growth in the cool season grasses. They're really revved up and they're growing again. And then we have warm season perennials. I like to try and stay away from just warm season grasses. We need to have diversity. And then, of course, we have warm season annuals. If you're just starting out and your farm is not meeting production, warm season annuals is a great way to make a lot of forage with just a little bit of money. And that being said, corn is excellent. Now, if you're grass finished only, that can create a problem. But corn, we've had 612 grazing days per acre with corn. And then full season annuals, that would be like oats, uh, winter rye, excuse me. Um, and then we got one grazing warm season annuals, which is corn and sorghum Sudan grass. You can graze that multiple times. Uh, Milo, grain sorghum, that's a one graze. And actually Milo, it's not quite as productive as corn, but it will do better in dry ground. So if you're expecting dry weather and you need to plant something, I call them kind of like emergency crops. And then we have our stockpiled forages, and that can be whatever's out there that the livestock can eat. The cool seasons is the typical uh, forages that most people stockpile. However, warm season grasses are good. Corn is excellent. Uh, if it's out there, it's good. So cover crops. Cover crops is a great way for farms that have beat up soil and are trying to improve their soil. Take for instance here, here's a tillage radish. Um, Tillage radishes, everybody thinks that they're good for breaking up compaction. That's not necessarily true. Tillage radishes, their taproot, they do have it's true, they have a taproot, but typically their taproot will go down, it hits a hard pan, and it will make a 90-degree turn. And it really doesn't do much for compaction. However, it is a nitrogen scavenger, so it will trap nutrients within that radish and release that back into the soil for other plants to use down the road. And this little plant right here is buckwheat. Um, Buckwheat has basically no usefulness to the livestock. It's 97% water. So they have to eat a lot of buckwheat. However, buckwheat is one of those plants that it's actually beneficial to the soil on the aspect that the roots of the buckwheat plant produce an acid that actually releases phosphorus out of the rocks. So that buckwheat plant can um, help with phosphorus deficiencies within your soil. And it can cover ground quickly, very quickly. And here's some of the corn that we've grazed in the past. That's 14 and a half feet tall. Those aren't small cows. Those are cows that, weigh 1,000 to 1,200 pounds. And it's a lot of fun to graze corn if you ever have the opportunity. And you can still graze corn and still be grass finished. The only thing is you have to graze it before the ears come on. And it's not typically a good idea to graze corn with sheep. Because sheep are very susceptible to acidosis. They'll get too much corn, um, and acidosis basically, for those that don't know what acidosis is in a rumen of a sheep, a cow, um, the grazing animals that have the compartmented stomachs, they have uh, microbes within that stomach, and that's what helps break down the food that their bodies are able to absorb. And what happens with acidosis is, like, if they eat a whole bunch of corn all at once and their bodies are not used to it, um, the bugs that are in their stomach actually die off and they cause a toxin, and that's where acidosis comes from. And this cow here, she's got a thing for corn. She sees that I have an ear of sweet corn. She will chase me down through the pasture, and she loves her corn. But here's my daughter when she was probably 3 years old. Um, Cows want to move. They're moving into a 25-foot section of corn, and you can see there's a lot left there for the untrained eye, but um, that that residue there will be gone by spring. If you have a really good, healthy system, all this residue that's left behind, it'll be gone by spring. So, don't worry about leaving stuff behind. It's more important to protect that soil than to worry about uh, and
Yeah.
this here's one of the cover crop studies that we did with Penn State University. Um, this here's Japanese millet, sorghum, sudan grass. and a crazy cow that jumps over fences. And to be quite honest with you, I'm really surprised that that held them back. Now, if you in the video at the beginning where my son was moving a cow, he was lifting the fence. That's how we move our cattle now. We just lift the fence. It takes too much. It doesn't take too much time, but it takes a little bit longer to reel the reel back and then put it back on the fence. We just walk up to it and lift the fence. And here's sorghum sedan grass. I believe it's 12 feet tall is how tall this is. You see, we got to run down a path here because if we set our fence within that, they're going to knock the sorghum sedan grass down and knock the fence down. And it's no fun catching cows in a field that's 12 feet tall. And then diversity. And this here's corn that we planted. This here's something that I thought was my idea, but Gabe Brown's been doing it for 25 years or whatever now. Plant my corn and then come back through and broadcast cover crop within the corn and have more of a diverse diet for the livestock to eat. Carbohydrates and plant growth. You can see these little droplets of water on this plant. This here's a strawberry leaf, and you can see it a lot on strawberry leaves, but you can also see it on grasses. That's not dew. That's what they call guttation water. It's from respiration throughout the night. The plants respirate throughout the night, and they guess exude water, or they have water that comes out in their leaves, and then these little droplets they form on the tips of the leaves. But we also need to keep in mind, in order for a plant to remain productive, it must photosynthesize first and feed the plant before it can feed our livestock. Oftentimes, a lot of producers they have that backwards. They think that the livestock are more important than the grass, and that's not how it is. Your soils are more important. That's what's going to allow you to have a whole lot of animals on your land. And looking at root growth, I have two slides here. And if we take too much, or if we cut too much off of the plant and we do that too often, our roots die back. And if we look at the plant that's on the right hand side, look at those huge root systems. Those root systems are going to be able to uptake nutrients and water compared to the plant that's on the left. This plant here is not going to make it through the drought or not be as productive through the drought. If you can keep these root systems large like this, you're not going to suffer the summertime droughts. And we do not suffer the summertime droughts so much on our farm, and I see it on a lot of other farms. And I tell folks take half, leave half. There's other people that don't recommend that. However, I mean, the research shows if we remove more than 50% of the volume, the plant, say we take 80%, 100% of our root systems are going to die back, and we just essentially trimmed our root systems, and the plant above ground is indicative to the roots that are below ground. So you need to keep that in mind. So I try to take 50% or less. That way this plant can continue to grow and be productive. Now this here is it's called the orchard grass response test. Dr. Ray Smith did this test. It's been a number of years ago. It's probably been over 10, 12 years ago since this is, but it's a very good demonstration of plants that have been, it's a simulation of plants that have been rotationally grazed versus continuously grazed. So they took two similar plants, orchard grass plants. They were chosen from a greenhouse. Both were managed the same for 6 months. Um, one was clipped once per month, or they were clipped once per month, supplied good fertility and water. And then the plant that you're going to see on the left-hand side simulates continuous grazing. And the plant that's on the right-hand side is going to be clipped at 3.5 inches and then clipped again 4 weeks later at 3.5 inches. So this here is very dramatic. If we look, which plant is growing, the one that was managed and not abused. This plant here basically is abused. And you'll see it a lot in your continuous graze systems because those animals like specific plants and they keep coming back and clipping and clipping and clipping. And those root systems are died back so bad that the plant really can't grow. This here is a field on my farm, and this here was one of those aha moments for me. This is back whenever I was still making hay. We were grazing across this field. The cows got to where they didn't want to graze it anymore. They were giving me troubles. So I moved them out of there into another field that they liked better. So that same day I moved them out of there, I made the hay on the other half of this field. It was about 50% across this field. And we keep our stubble height high whenever we were making hay. In 10 days, the stubble height's 5 inches, 10 days, the regrowth, it was 8 inches tall. So we had a total of 3 inches of growth in 10 days here. But the stubble height that we left at 8 inches, in 10 days, the regrowth there was 15 inches tall. So we had a total of 7 inches. So we gained 4 more additional inches of growth on the plants that we left higher. And if we look at this, if we look at this, on a production standpoint, typically a good thick pasture, and this is a very, very thick pasture, we can expect 250 inches or 250 pounds of dry matter per inch of grass per acre. And so this field here, it produced about 750 pounds of dry matter. And then this one here produced, a lot more. It produced 1,000 pounds more than this one here did. So, that's a huge difference in 10 days. 1,000 pounds, that's a lot. Don't be afraid to go out there and make some mistakes. Let's make better mistakes tomorrow. There's a lot of things that we try here on the farm, and here was a mistake that I made here on the farm. That was last year that I made this mistake. This is the wettest part of my farm, and I went to bed without checking the weather, and here we ended up with 2 inches of rainfall that night, and that's what the cows did. Now that looks a lot worse than the picture. We're very good at if you're very good at taking pictures, you can make things look worse than they really are. That's only about a 30-foot circle of mud there. But however, with the resilience being at this soil has been rested and the plants are have these large root systems, there's more resilience there. And within less than 20 days, you'd never know that mud spot was there. Typically, we like to graze higher. And then whenever we're done, we want it to be flat. We want it to be right to the ground. If we leave, there's some standing here, and that's fine. I don't want a lot standing, because if this is flat down to the ground, it's going to put cover on the ground. It's going to protect that ground against moisture loss, erosion. There's just so many benefits, and it's also going to keep the soil a lot cooler, or it's going to be a lot warmer depending on what time of year we're looking at. So, these grasses can actually grow longer into the year if we have that protection on them, or they can grow during the dry period of the year. This here is the catalog of all the species of plants that I have within my pastures on a farm. And we're actually up to 84 species, 184 species now. A lot of them are, for a lot of folks, are undesirable. They call them weeds, but those plants are there for a reason. Let me see here. If we take, for instance, let's look at, New England aster. That is high in zinc. If we look at some of these thistles, like bull thistle, once it blooms, that plant is actually dead. Yeah, well, it's going to produce seeds, but how did it start growing there anyhow? The seed is already in your seed bank. So, I don't know what the benefit would be to go out and clip them or spray them. A lot of folks will go out and spray them, thinking that they're doing something, good, but really, no. Wild carrot, Queen Anne's lace. That's another one that's a biennial. It's dead as soon as it blooms. Well, there's some here that I don't have on here. Yeah. So if we look at these plants and we rest these plants, we have these huge root systems, and these root systems are all different within all the plants. We dig them up. I've dug tons and tons of them up. Take for instance this purple coneflower. We actually have those growing on our farm. The root systems aren't as robust as, say, the big blue stem that's right beside it. So this big blue stem, in theory, could be bringing nutrients up for this purple coneflower, and this purple coneflower could be somehow releasing nutrients that the big blue stem's not able to access. But we look at the far left-hand side here. We don't want that. That's Kentucky bluegrass. Which plants are going to be more productive? Definitely not our Kentucky bluegrass that's clipped or mowed once a week. And I always put this in the PowerPoints multiple times, and I know it's redundant, but it is that important. Which plant is going to soak up more nutrients? What plants are going to make your farm more productive, let you have more livestock, and more livestock in return, is, your lifeline. That's how the bills get paid. This here's another way of looking at it. We knew this back in 1955. Why are people still overgrazing? And I was at fault on overgrazing at one point. And I got to be careful. I got to be careful today because it's very easy to do. Overgrazing is a very easy thing to do. So, be careful. Your root systems. Your root systems, you want them long and deep. Here's a chicory root that we traced down 36 inches. You can see all these other roots within the soil structure. All those huge, deep roots are very, very important. And another thing those big roots do is whenever we're building driveways or we're stabilizing areas that we can drive our vehicles, we put down what they call geotextile fabric. And basically, it's a carpet that we put underneath of gravel. And whenever we put that underneath there, it protects the gravel from sinking in and just disappearing and still getting your truck stuck or whatever. And that geotextile works for the livestock. It keeps them up on top of the soil more so you don't make as much mud. High stock density rotational grazing. We have a smaller amount of living system disturbance. That is one of the keys that we need to really look at. We want the minimal amount of disturbance. So we get in, we graze, we have our event, and we get off. And whenever we do that, we have a faster nutrient cycling. Uh, if your pastures are doing well, that manure should be pretty well all gone from the livestock, unless it's super dry or if it's freezing. Naturally, our microbes aren't going to be working, but we want that gone within 14 days on whenever everything's working the way it should be. And of course, erosion, is a major problem within farmland. Just north of me, here's the Lake Erie watershed, and they're having a problem with phosphorus and potassium running off the farms. And we want to be able to not have that erosion. Less time taking care of livestock. My son and I had a doctor's appointment this morning, and my son and we went over, we moved the cows, moved the water, fed the hogs, and we were back at the house here in 25 minutes. So you can do it relatively fast. It's just a matter of setting your mind to it and doing it. And then of course, livestock are healthier. We don't have that thing with our vet anymore. I honestly, I don't have a vet. My vet actually is retired, so I don't have a veterinarian that comes to the farm anymore. Whenever we have these high stock density grazing, the livestock compete for available forages, so they become non-selective grazers, and that's another key that we really want. We want that non-selective grazing. That way, whenever they go across, and it's really something whenever they're in a high stock grazing system, whenever you have them like 400,000 pounds to the acre, and then you loosen them up, those cows, they go shoulder to shoulder and work in unison across the field, and they eat everything. There's nothing that the cows won't eat. Now here's this guy. Here's my mentor, the guy that told me to move cows once a day. And he was an NRCS grazing specialist, and he was always nice to me, but I knew deep down he thought I was crazy and some of the stuff that I can come up with. But this year we put the cows at 800,000 pounds to the acre. There was around, like, I want to say 90 cows on a tenth of an acre. We put them in there for 20 minutes. We marked all the dung and urine spots. We had 500 flags, and we could have used another probably 250 flags. We ran out of flags. We couldn't. So, every one of those flags are representing manure, urine, and dung. So that's what the goal is, or the end goal. And this kind of looks what 300,000 pounds of livestock looks like to the acre. And my cow herd looks different than it does there. This was taken back in 2015. There's some pretty big cows in there yet. The cow size has really changed. Animal performance. They have a higher energy to protein ratio. It's really good. A lot of folks think, well, that's overgrown. If it's done correctly, it's not really a problem. From about the middle of July to about the second week in August in my area, the forage is its lowest quality. So what I'll do is I'll move the cows back to where we started about the second week in July. And what happens is these grasses, they become mature, and whenever they mature, they shoot out rhizomes and they start regrowing. So we have plants in all stages of growth. That's where our energy to protein ratio is good. Typically, if I were to test something like this the second week in August, you're looking about 14 to 16% crude protein. And if you want to put weight on an animal, you don't need much more than 16% crude protein. Now you do need some energy, and you'll have that energy in those newer plants. This here represents continuous grazing. We just put the cows out there. We have a few shade trees. We have a watering point here. and the cows just basically go to their favorite spots throughout the year. And what happens is whenever they're continuously grazing, they have the choice to hang out at the water point and hang out in the trees in the summertime. So we move our nutrients from in the center of our field to our watering point and our trees. Now, this here represents rotational grazing and keeping water with them. If we keep water with them and we put them in smaller paddocks, our manure is better distributed. And that's another one of the keys. Not only we need rest, we need manure, our manure distributed uh, evenly across the field, or as evenly as possible. Sometimes you just do the best you can. And then Martha's doing this here on her farm right now. She has some weed problems, and if we make her paddocks long and narrow, that causes more foot traffic, and we're able to tramp those undesirable plants down that the livestock typically won't eat. I think we're at about our point here, aren't we, Christina? We want to answer some questions.
Yeah, that's a great time to pause, just
Yeah,
you've given us a lot to look at, and some from the the U-turn back to when you were here in June presenting, but also new information, which is really helpful, especially when
yeah,
you can see comparatively one to one,
yeah.
right? So, yes, there's some questions in the chat. So why don't we go to Michael Wilk? He had a question about, he had purchased a former veggie farm and he's converting it to pasture-based farm. Yahoo, thank you that there's some shift away from tilling. I love my vegetables, but it's always good to hear people converting to pasture after a tilling
Mhm.
operation. What cover crop or crops would you recommend I use to suppress weeds before I seed down with expensive pasture seed? That's a really good question.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I see a lot of folks, or I've worked with folks that are in veggie production. They'll have a 60-acre farm, and veggie production's usually 5-acre veggie production. If it's very productive, that's a lot of veggies and a lot of work for one person. Um, Typically what I would do, if you're doing vegetables, typically you'll have your crops through the summertime, and then those crops are, they're basically summertime annuals or warm season annuals. Typically what I would recommend is coming in after your vegetables with a cover crop such as winter rye, annual ryegrass, uh, and another good one is hairy vetch. And you could also put some red clover, maybe some white clover with that. And then you come around into the spring. And if you have livestock and you're able to graze it, graze it. If you're still making hay, make the hay off of it. And then go in with your pasture seed mix. Just make sure you get that pasture seed mix in before it starts drying out. You can get very good seedings in the spring of the year.
That will never go away. Michael,
That it,
does that answer your question? Because I think you were saying it's no longer in vegetables. Let's see if I can unmute. Yeah. I don't know if he can. He's unmuted, but not sure if we can get him to. I know he put it in the chat, maybe for a reason. Yes, if you can't speak, just from how the question reads, it was formerly a veggie farm, so therefore,
okay. Yep.
goes,
My mistake.
before he goes through the, yeah, he's answering yes. Before he goes through, the investment of expensive pasture seed, what kind of things could he put down? And I believe like for a whole year, is that what you're thinking, Mike? Like what for like maybe a whole year to prepare it?
You don't necessarily have to go a whole year, but if that's something that you really want to do, I
Uh-huh.
would we're coming into the time of year when you can do those winter cover crops. And then if, you don't want to put it back into permanent pasture quite yet, go with your warm season uh, cover crops. The big thing is to keep that soil covered, because that's where your weeds come from. It's just, your weeds and your undesirable plants come in whenever Mother Nature has the opportunity, bare soil. It just allows those weeds to germinate. Sunlight helps a lot of the undesirable plants germinate whenever they get to the surface of the soil. That's what triggers them to germinate. So, um, the summertime the summertime cover crops, I would suggest something like maybe sorghum, sedan grass, sunflowers, clovers. What else would you put into that? I mean, there's so many really good things you can put in that. Sun hemp, if you're going into a wet area where, a lot of those cover crops don't do well in a wet situation. uh Japanese millet's a great one. Just get something growing on there, keep a live root in there, and don't allow those weeds to have the chance to take root, because that's where the problem comes.
Great.
It's easier to prevent a problem than to deal with the problem.
Yeah. Well, and
It's
that,
it's just like your livestock. If at one time we had selenium deficiencies within the livestock, and selenium deficiency causes what they call white muscles disease. And basically it causes the calves to be slow to get up, slow to nurse. Cows don't clean the placentas. Uh, and it's a lot easier to the remedy for it is to give the cow and the babies a shot of what they call Mu-C or Bo-C, and it's a selenium vitamin E uh, shot. But if we feed a mineral that has selenium in it, we're preventing the problem versus treating the problem.
so on that note of preventing problems, he's a follow-up question on, fixing soil compaction. And typically the recommendation, he's saying using a ripper or subsoiler, is it worth doing?
No, no, there's a lot of controversy on that. A ripper or subsoiler. If you look, a ripper actually reduces, or a ripper will actually decrease your organic material quicker in the soil than anything. Especially a deep ripper. If you want to fix compaction, I recommend something, a cover crop. Annual ryegrass is probably the best out there for compaction issues. You want a plant that has fine fibrous roots. And I talked about the radish earlier, that folks think it's great for breaking up compaction. Annual ryegrass is the best. It's hands down. I can't think of another plant that's better of breaking up compaction. And annual ryegrass usually grows in some pretty poor places. So if you can do it without a ripper or a subsoiler, you're going to be ahead of the game on the aspect of you're not going to be. We kind of want a high, well, not kind of, we want a high uh, organic material in our soil. For every 1 point of organic material, you can hold up to 1 inch of rainfall, and a 1 inch of rainfall is 27,000 gallons per acre. So, for every point, we're holding more water, and it typically takes 250,000 gallons of water to produce 1 ton of fescue hay. So it takes a lot of water in order to produce this stuff. So we need to um, try and keep our organic material up. That's one of the big things.
Yeah, and I'll just share to reinforce what you said. I mean, as a grazer, I know that all the folks from the Soil Food Web actually share a history of the NRCS practices around compaction. They actually used the slide showing each consecutive decade that they are, let's try another machine to break compaction, and let's go deeper, and let's go deeper, and let's go deeper. And what she essentially said is they were undermining their efforts all along. They could have solved the problem within a 3 to 5 year practice. But,
Yeah.
and, you don't know till you know, like, let's learn from our mistakes, or, fail forward. But they kept trying to force a square peg in a round hole. And if we can save somebody the trouble of doing that, that would be good.
Well,
You said the tiller
and
rack, Martha just confirmed while we were on mute, she remembers the carrots going down and taking a right-hand turn,
yeah,
so,
yeah, carrots, yes.
the tiller radish
Yep.
should come maybe a little later once that initial compaction is
Mhm.
broken up. But,
And another thing that's going to help with compaction as well, your microbes are really going to help aerate that soil and help with compaction. But not only your microbes rest. Whenever you're grazing your lands and you build that rest, moving the livestock multiple times a day or more frequently, we're putting a back fence on those animals so they can't go back to where they were the day previous or 2 days or wherever, how often you're moving them. And we're resting that soil, and that rest actually helps with that compaction as well.
great. Well, thank you. I hope that answer. We have some other questions to move on to. Edward is asking, how do you prep land for planting corn? Lightly disc or no-till straight into the pasture? Seed drilling.
Yeah, that's a great question because corn's one of those plants that cannot take competition. So, however, you typically would uh, establish your corn, that's how you pretty much have to do it. In the no-till setup, to my knowledge, about the best way to do it, and don't start throwing sticks at me here or anything, but to use a herbicide burn down, and then no-till in after you kill the weeds. Now, if you're organic or something like that, then you're probably going to have to do maybe a light disking, or you may even, I hate to say it, but you may have to even plow the land. And um, even if you do have to plow, it's only kind of like a one-time deal. If you plow and plant your corn into that, and once you get that land prepped, once that corn's done, go with a cool season cover crop. And you can almost, if you do it correctly, you almost can get away without any herbicides, no disking, just straight no-till into. But that initial getting the annuals established is the tough part.
So Martha's reminded me, we really do kind of go around and around learning about, defined disturbance, plan disturbance. If this is a one-off so that you can like get your land ready, like if it's just disking once to like get that in, if you're transitioning where you're going to try corn, like you're showing that picture with corn and then rows for grazing. Well, yeah, I mean, that's disking for corn is not awful if you're putting something in between it that's going to help fix the soil, or restore the
Yeah,
soil.
it's kind of like a one-time deal. I really hate to suggest somebody to plow their land, but um, if you can do a light disking, and what you got to do is basically set the plants back so the corn doesn't have the competition.
Right. Right.
I tried for a number of years everything that I could think of. I had a 5 year thing, and I just could not get corn to grow in existing pasture fields. It just cannot take the competition. Now, if you want to just kind of thicken your pasture up, there's a couple things that you can annuals that you can put in there. Sorghum sudan grass, Japanese millet, and sunflowers are all three do fairly well. I mean, they suffer a little bit from the competition. However, if there's a bare spot within those fields, they'll fill in and grow and give you production.
And just one last note on a shout out to our C&D who had some really experimental grazers come, or actually growers of corn, should say, and how they were experimenting with cover crops. And they actually like pruned their corn, you know, like cut
Mhm.
it. Everybody, and this is in the Midwest, people, like everyone thought this farmer was off his rocker. But what he proved was that, like a plant, it just bulked out and, it created the necessary shade initially for the weeds,
Mhm.
not to get a
Yeah.
hell. And then I believe he also got something else in there in between the corn, but I don't know what it was. So,
Mhm.
this taking those risks, obviously not doing it wholesale, but like trying a test strip of like what you suggested, Russ, of rows of corn with a cover crop in between,
Yeah. I mean,
great
I don't,
patch,
you don't want to go out and do the whole farm at one time. Just for, we've done small plots and like, take for example, warm season grasses. I didn't know if that was something that I wanted to mess with or not. So I went in my backyard and I made 6 plots. I made they're 2 feet by 6 feet, and I planted warm season grasses. And I started growing those just to see if that's something that I wanted to mess with. So, you don't necessarily want to go out and, you know, make loans on the farm or whatever to do test stuff. Experimental stuff, I recommend to start with small plots and um, do your research and try and do um, start small.
On that note, we want to shift gears and address Robert's question about how do you move water around and what do you use. I know you have some slides later in the presentation.
I do.
Okay,
I
so
do.
let's put that just in
I
the
don't.
neutral for 1 second, because then we can just talk a little bit more about some of the cover crops, and then maybe we can scroll to answer Robert
Yes.
about.
Yes, we'll do that. I have pictures that I can show.
Yeah, we'll definitely fast forward to those in a moment. But there was also a follow-up question by Mike about the buckwheat. You did say buckwheat is majority is water, but if he is going to have a whole year, then buckwheat is his friend, right? You just mentioned it's an ally to
Yeah,
some.
whenever you plant those cover crops, you don't want just one plant. You know, it's diversity. You want to put diversity in there. Buckwheat, another great thing that buckwheat's good for is your pollinators. The pollinators absolutely love buckwheat, and if for some reason you have honeybees, buckwheat honey is highly sought after. You can sell every pound of buckwheat honey you can produce.
That's
But buckwheat, absolutely put it in the mix. It's a warm season. It's a warm season annual. When we were doing cover crops, I always threw a couple pounds of buckwheat in per acre, and it's not that expensive. I mean, buckwheat's relatively inexpensive compared to some of these other plants that that's another thing, like raised crazy mix. To me, that mix has always been way too expensive for me to plant. I think I want to say the last time I looked at it was like almost $80 or $90 an acre to establish raised crazy mix. And um, you can buy the individual species and mix them together yourself and be a third of the cost of these pre-mixed uh, seeds that you're putting in. So um, yeah, uh,
I'm glad you brought that up.
trying. Mhm.
Having from the start experimenting, not paying for that experimentation. We only did some trials solitary with buckwheat, and it did not come through as well as those multi mixes. But we did go to the other extreme of having, I think, like 15 different seeds from Cover Green, And that was too much, so what is your sweet spot? Like, if you're going to experiment and start with a couple different things, is it like 3 to 5 varieties? What is, you know, what,
Um,
not a crazy mix, in other words.
to to me, three species is pretty much still a monocrop.
Okay. Good.
I would recommend 5 or more.
Okay.
The more you can put in, the better. Uh, we've at one time we did 27 species in one cover crop mix. Um, and not all of them did anything. I mean, a lot of like I can't grow sun hemp and I can't grow rape here on my farm. They won't grow. But I found that out after trying to plant them a few times.
Well, and I want to plug too that a number of you are coming to the farm next Tuesday. We'll be able to share with you what the Milpa mix did, which was a huge,
Mhm.
and how some things outcompeted each other. But that was planted in pure, luscious organic matter. So that's a little bit
Mhm.
not what people have, but we did have examples of multiple species mix in rows of an old CSA, actually an old conversion from a vegetable farm. So that might be interesting to Michael to see that,
Mhm.
6 years.
Yeah, that's pretty that Milfa mix is pretty cool looking.
Yeah, yeah. So we're really looking forward to that. I want to move on to some of the other questions.
Sure.
Actually has a really good planning question that I'm going to hold just to the end because it does sort of help summarize your experience. Um,
Okay.
so we'll start to move on to the subject of water, which is, how to move water around, what do you use? And then in the 3 years when you did have water lines above ground, how did you handle pipes freezing in the winter? So just let's maybe scroll forward to some of the water slides. And talk.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, let me get to the water here.
And we'll have plenty of time to talk about weeds when you come on farm next week because
Yeah. Yeah.
that's been
Um
the of this place. Here we go. Tiny tank.
like whenever we started with water, we had cast iron bathtubs that we used, and they're stationary because we just couldn't move them around. So we started experimenting with water tanks, and this here is basically a mortar mixing tub with a high flow valve in it, and we've actually watered 120 animal units out of this tank. And the way we did that is we keep that water within 200 to 300 feet of them at all times. And by doing that, they only one or two animals come to water at a time. So uh, having and then another thing that we add on in the summertime, whenever it's not freezing, I run a 250 feet worth of garden hose. And I have Blossom water hookups, quick connects, and I also have hydrants. And this hydrant here is not a recommended hydrant. That is just from that's from Tractor Supply, and they don't last. So uh, that's that tank. This tank here is a 55-gallon Rubbermaid tank. I put valve support in it. Now this here, the Job valve has a thing called a Frost Pro, and you turn it on and the water weeps and it just keeps flowing. I've only been successful down to 9 degrees. We put a piece of foam on the hydrant, and then we put a piece of foam on our garden hose, and that keeps it um, from freezing down. And then I went to this setup, which I don't use anymore. However, if you're in a really cold area, you might want to do that. Underneath this 55-gallon drum is a hydrant, and then I have an insulated hose that goes across to an insulated tank with a high flow valve in it. And this here's a pool noodle. Pool noodles work very well for insulating your hoses. Um, see. Okay, this here's a valve that I developed. I actually make and sell this valve now, and you'll actually be able to see it. Does Martha still have her tank there someplace that everybody can look at it?
Yep, it's
Um,
how she said.
okay. Martha has this style of tank. It has a high flow valve in it, and then uh, I drill and tap and put a needle valve on the pressure side, and then we can open that up and let it weep. And this here's been tested to 34 below zero. I have people in Saskatchewan, Canada, using it. And actually, I boxed up 2 tanks today, and they're headed to Montana. And Montana is a cold. However, I'm not trying to sell you a tank or a valve by any means. I actually have YouTube videos on it to show you how to do it. I just do it because folks don't want to. They either don't have the tools, they don't have the know-how, or they just plain don't want to build a valve in a tank. So I do build them and sell them. And then if you look here, this here's whenever the ground is soft out, I take 2 foot wide belting that's 4 feet wide, and then I put handles on it, and I put that around the tank because that's always the wet spot. Okay. Now, I don't really have pictures of the um uh my hydrants, so I can't really show that, but we don't use the above ground line in the wintertime. It's just impossible. So you seen in the beginning there, I have 40 some hydrants. We jump from hydrant to hydrant to hydrant, and this is all we use. I know a lot of folks like the Colbert frostproof uh, watering units. There's the drinking post. There's a lot of them out there, but they cost like $1,000. You can build this tank for a couple $100, and then uh, the hydrant, like I said, if you put them in yourself, they're not expensive. You can have 3 hydrants to one Colbert frostproof watering tank, and having 5 of those hydrants, you can spread your nutrients out. Your animals aren't coming back to one spot to water all the time.
Great.
And we can go in more depth when we're at the farm next week about that.
Yeah, that would be helpful again, because we're not yet set up with hydrants and things like that. So there's a lot of
Yeah.
workarounds that you can do
Yeah,
with.
water is the biggest issue on all farms. That's fences are easy, moving paddocks is easy. It's just water is the biggest issue on all farms.
Yeah, so we can talk a little bit about the workarounds that they do here. That we did also have, I missed this earlier, NJ Pack, I'm not sure whose name that is, but they have a question about combating pigweed.
Pigweed. Pig Pigweed is one of those plants that come on when you got bare soil. Um, are we combating the pigweed in a grazing system, or are we doing it in a cropping system? Because it's going to be two different ways of combating it.
Let me see if
Typically,
share any answer. I know sometimes people don't, I'll ask them to unmute and hope they can engage in the question a little bit more, but I know a lot of people are multitasking on this
yeah.
thing.
Typically, pigweed or amaranth or spiny amaranth. The spiny amaranth is
Great, thank you. It's on a grazing system.
it's in a grazing system. Okay. The pigweeds has come in because there's bare soil, and typically you'll see pigweed in areas where you feed hay, or there's been like the cows have stood at a gate or something like that. typically the pigweed will go away if you rest the soil and get perennials to grow. We had a problem here with pigweed and mare's tail, and mare's tail's an herbicide resistant weed. It's not a big deal. Pigweed usually, once you start rotating your livestock more frequently and they become less selective, pigweed actually becomes one of their targeted species that they actually really like. And pigweed is actually a highly nutritious plant.
Well, that's a good way to, just focus back on management, right?
Yeah,
Like,
but yeah, management's the key there, I think. Uh, if you can get grasses and stuff growing, just try not to let the soil become bare. And another area that pigweed could be a problem too is like in a sacrifice paddock. Um, oftentimes folks will take like a 5 acre paddock and uh, open it up to the livestock throughout the wintertime, and that can become muddy and let pigweed. Canadian thistle's another one that will take an opportunity in open bare ground. Ragweed, um, lamb's quarter. Uh, I said mare's tail. Those are all opportunistic plants.
that could eventually be frenemies amidst other plants. They could be food.
Yeah. They can be food, but I used to really, like pigweed and mare's tail and thistles. I used to go out and with a sickle and cut thistles down. And, I didn't know that heck after they bloomed, they were dead. So I spent a lot of time out there doing, but typically, you just need to change your management and that pigweed will go away. Yeah.
Yeah, right.
We can look at, we're gonna walk across the farm
Mhm.
next week, and one of the fields that we were walked into this spring was full of Canadian thistle. That Canadian thistle's pretty much all gone in that field just because of the way it was grazed. Isaac did an excellent job of grazing it. He nailed it and he got rid of those Canadian thistles.
It's great. It's great. Well,
Yeah.
there's a couple questions I want to make sure we give enough time to. They're actually tied nicely together from Ashley and Rebecca about what your experience was like working with a rotational grazing specialist from NRCS, and how did you go about from transitioning your farm from a 7 to 14 day grazing operation to a 294-day grazing system?
Yeah. That is a great question. I was very fortunate with my grazing specialist. The NRCS, it's very I guess it's kind of the luck of the draw who you get to work with. There's probably a grazing specialist assigned to your area. If you go to your conservation district or the USDA and get a hold of those guys and say, hey, I would like to meet with my grazing specialist. They'll come out and the grazing specialist will write you a free grazing plan. They're very helpful in that aspect. And they also, can get you grant money and different things like that. They can be very, very helpful. So, I highly recommend, you work with your grazing specialist. If you do take grant money, just make sure you read the contracts. Because there's been some people that have got in trouble a little bit. They weren't able to follow through with what they wanted in the contract, and they ended up having to pay all this money back and stuff. But take their technical support. Sometimes they're a little bit conventional minded, so you kind of have to weed through it. But if you get a good grazing specialist, they'll be very, very helpful. And all their support is free. It doesn't cost you anything.
I mean, it's a good introduction, right? I think we were talking about this earlier in terms of the context. You know, they design for the masses, so there's a kind of standard operating procedure, but
Yeah.
you know, the kind of process and steps of changing, I would say, you know, there comes a point where you're likely going to want to step outside their standard operating procedure because of the way your land is responding. I mean, this is the very thing that's happened here, and we're going to go into greater detail about that next week, about, you know, what the contract says to do and then what the land actually does and what the animals do, you know. And so we
Yeah.
want to talk
Yeah.
about, that's the very definition of adaptive grazing, right? You set out with an intention, and then you have to track it, and then you get the feedback. And so we found out we had to leave the map, so to speak, that was written out according to their
Yeah.
seating specifications. And so we look forward to getting into more detail when we actually on the ground in talking about the steps of how we had to change the previous plan. So we'll just have a placeholder for that next week. And then um, the question from Rebecca, you know, how do you time pastures that you're stockpiling? Are they grazed earlier in the year? Is it full of seed heads? You know, what is the nutrient profile like?
You know, that is a very, very good question. You know, timing your paddocks for stockpiling. The conventional way of thinking on stockpile, they want you to have 60 days of rest on it. Personally, I like a little longer rest because it gets me more forage. Typically, the lives, 60 days of rest, you're not going to have the tonnage there that you need if you're going to be grazing through snow. Um, Typically, I like to see at least 6,000 pounds of dry matter, which is typically it's like a 30 inches worth of grass, and it be nice and thick because your animals are not going to go through snow if there's nothing there. And I have pictures here. This here's what stockpile looks like typically. Usually it's laid over. It's only about 7 inches off the ground, but you can see here this grazing stick is 36 inches. So if you raise that up, you should have grass leaves anywhere from 25 to, I've measured orchard grass leaves 50 some inches long. Uh, but typically we want it bent over so that actually protects the grasses and kind of puts it in a deep freeze. So typically like orchard grass, fescue, once it goes to seed in the spring and you graze that off, it's not going to go back to seed again. So there won't typically be any seed heads. Now, if it's like here on my farm, there's a couple fields, like I said, we have not grazed yet this year. There will be seed heads there. But if we take and look, these here are forage samples. Here's purchased hay, 8% crude protein, and then in vitro dry matter digestibility is 45. We want that at 50. This here is purchased hay, keep in mind. Now, pasture 8, it wasn't the worst pasture we've had. We're at 10%. You can look at the date. It's the test was taken December 29th. 10% crude protein and IVDMD is 60. And what we found is these plants, if they're still vegetated whenever we go into the wintertime and they freeze, the cell walls of those plants actually burst, and it's actually the digestibility goes up in them, which actually makes them a higher quality forage. Here's one, pasture F6, crude protein 7.7 and a 52 IVDMD. For gestational sheep or gestational cows, that is acceptable. Now, if you're trying to finish animals, you're not going to put weight on finisher animals. Or if you have lactational animals, they're not going to make milk on that. But for gestational animals, it's acceptable. Now, if we look here, F17A, December 29th, crude protein 17%, IVDMD 63. Um, so the quality's still there. Like this field here, that would have been this 10.2 percent crude protein, which is pretty good field actually. For the untrained eye, that typically, you'd say, oh, that looks terrible. It's not any good. The tests don't lie.
Thank you. That's, we're getting onto the top of the hour, so I just want to squeeze in a few more questions.
Sure.
And of course, Rebecca, there is also questions about record keeping and data points. I don't know if you could answer that briefly. We are going to dive into the economics next Tuesday, and I do plan on recording that. And that will be at some point, for those that can't attend, we'll be able to share some details
Mhm.
around, winter planning and seasonal planning. So we'll put that question in the parking lot, but definitely address it, and it will be recorded if you can't attend. The mysterious iPhone. We're trying to figure out if we're asking to unmute. Who might be the iPhone? Do you?
Yeah, let me touch on the record keeping here real quick. Um, there's a few different things that you can use. I use iNotes on my phone to keep like stuff that I see in the field, like cow numbers, birthings, anybody that has been sick or different grasses. There is an app called Pasture Map. You can mark all your data points with that. Uh, it costs you. Now you can set up a thing with Google Docs that works similar to Pasture Map, except for you don't have the data points and stuff saved GPS in your phone or on your computer. So there is different ways of keeping records. And then of course, at one time for the first, I haven't done it for probably 5 or 6 years. I just kept a notepad with me and wrote things down in a notepad. But everybody's got a phone now. I use iNotes a lot on the phone to take notes and different things. Okay, we got some more questions.
Yeah, if you could scroll to the very end of your presentation, because there's a slide there that sort of summarizes what we've talked about today. And I'll just read through some of the last of it. I don't know how to address this person. I'm asking to unmute. Do you use grazing alfalfa? I have frost
Um,
alfalfa just like you do with clover, but of course you can't thicken the stand with subsequent seedlings.
uh, Typically like grazing alfalfa. I have alfalfa that I planted here on the farm. 2011, 2012-ish. It was a grazing alfalfa. It was the branch root type alfalfa. Um, I've kind of gotten away from alfalfa because alfalfa is kind of a high input crop. It requires fertilizer and a lot of lime. And your clovers can perform as good, but uh, these alfalfas that I planted way back when, 12 years ago, they're still growing in these fields and they're doing really, really well. And the reason for that is typically alfalfa is only good for 3 to 4 years and then it's no good. Um, so if you rest it, those plants are able to survive and continue to grow. And I've also with the alfalfa, I've also left it go to seed, and I've stockpiled it, and the cows actually ate the seed heads and was able to bring the alfalfa back into the field. Um,
Oh, that's actually one of those unusual ways that we learned about, all we're so obsessed with machinery and drilling seeds and whatnot, and that's part
yep,
of how you maintain or increase your seeding through your animals. You're actually feeding them,
right.
having the animals
Yeah.
distribute. Um,
Yeah. And, definitely, you can frost seed alfalfa just like clover. However, I would recommend broadcasting in front of your livestock on the first graze of the year. That seems to do better than frost seeding.
That's great.
Um,
Okay, I think there was just,
yeah, yeah, it's hard to thicken up an alfalfa stand. And the reason being for that is there's some allelopathic tendencies there with the alfalfa, and it won't let new seed to grow.
okay, we're at the, past the top of that, just one follow-up question from Robert about, and you may have to think on it, don't by any means feel you're on the spot here at this point. We're just
Mhm.
going over the rotating a herd around a 10-acre pasture, but struggling to get water to the far paddocks. Running a ton of hose to set up a water trail that tended to get overgrazed and beaten down. So if there's any sort of on the spot sort of recommendations or something you can think of,
Yeah,
get back
yes.
sharing
You
information.
know, 10 acres, you're probably looking at probably 1,000 feet. I'm guessing you're going to have to run hose, depending on the shape of the field naturally. Um, this year we went and bought irrigation pipe, and it's just 70 psi, half-inch pipe. Uh, we can get it for $34 for 500 feet. And then you buy the fittings for on the end, which is only maybe another $10 or so. And you can run that pipe relatively inexpensively across that field to get water over there. Yeah, if you were to buy a bunch of hose or whatever, that's going to cost a fortune. And uh, you can get 1,000, you can do 1,000 feet of this black plastic pipe for less than $100.
Actually, we are going to experiment with that because we're not fast tracking the underground irrigation here. And I believe that was a
Mhm.
recommendation made. And oh, the cows are saying they approve. So I want to thank, is it a runoff, a hydrant is what Robert's follow-up question is with what you just described.
Whenever I first started, I just ran a hose out from my pressure tank in the barn. I have a water pressure tank in the barn, and I just ran it from a hose out of the barn. It doesn't have to be super fancy by no means. It just has to be functional.
Yes. And on that note, functional is what's driving this sustainable operating procedure. This summary you have here is a beautiful way to capture everything you've shared here. It's a very generous presentation, and it's something that we hope to also reinforce when you visit. All the benefits of the extended grazing season, the increase in soil structure, the water holding capacity is something we're very interested in, being so close to a river, increasing that infiltration. The weed control is the best surprise, Russ, that you've brought Martha and I, because me being a land care sort of consultant that wants to put a lot of energy into restoration right out of the gate, and Martha being like, hold up, I'm telling you, these animals can do the job. Don't go running around, you know, putting too much effort in things,
Yep.
And so she really
Mhm.
had to ask me to pump my brakes and be like, let's just see what the animals can do. But even she said, with our first pass with consultants, it was pretty terrifying. Like, what are they saying? We believe they can make it work because they're making it work, but how are they? They're sharing their information, but how do we make it knowledge, right? So we
Yep.
can't stress enough to everybody to seek out the specialist that speaks your language. Is that Russ says is when Martha found Russ,
Yep.
it suddenly something connected. The translation occurred between that information and making it knowledge or practice first, of course, practicing it and trialing it in small ways, and then it becomes knowledge. So then you can start to benefit from what you're saying here, the break in the parasite cycles, how you're sequestering the soil nutrients, and most importantly, your higher financial gain to feed yourselves so that you can feed other people. That's really what this is about. You have to feed
Yeah.
yourself first before you can feed other people. And the more free time, if for people that are doing this as a part-time or retirement or a startup while they're working hard in their first jobs, early in their
Yeah.
life, really
Yeah.
want to encourage that. And I think we got, a wrap up. We're gonna, anything else, the last minute things to bring up, before we sign off?
Okay, here's one. Ideas on getting rid of horse nettle, and bed straw, also called goosegrass. Bed straw is actually, if you test it, bed straw is actually a really, really good quality forage for your livestock. And horse nettle is definitely a difficult one to work with. It's one of those ones where I have some horse nettle here. Well, I have a lot of horse nettle here. The best thing is preventative maintenance. Horse nettle is a very opportunistic plant. Whenever it gets, it's another one of those ones. If you have bare soil, it's going to come on hard. So trying not to get it is probably the best thing. However, my cows actually eat the stuff. It's considered toxic, along with every other plant out there. If you look at it, uh, alfalfa is considered a very toxic plant. But if you can get your livestock to eat it, it's not necessarily a problem. So, getting rid of it, if it's there, you're not going to get rid of it. You can go out and spray it and different things like that, but it's best just to try and get your livestock or teach your livestock how to eat it.
Well, and also we might, take a
With the
quick,
exception of horses. Let me put a disclaimer in there. Horses are very, very susceptible to toxins. So we don't want our horses to be eating the toxic plants, but cattle and sheep and stuff like that, we can dilute those toxic plants in their rations, and it's still just fine.
and yeah, to that note, we might give an example of a density of that type of weed here, and how, how do you compare that to everything else they're eating in the paddock? Like, okay, if that's only 10%, or if it exceeds a certain percentage of the paddock, then, I've seen you go through efforts of roping it off. So we'll definitely
Mm.
touch on that in the field. Because again, as much as we're learning with Kathy Both that you can train cows to eat weeds, we certainly, want
Um,
to use,
yeah, Kathy Voth definitely has a program that you can teach your livestock how to eat weeds. Um, there's been a lot of folks out there. There's been a lot of mixed mixed people that have been able to teach them. So um, to me, it's a lot easier just to just neck them down, get them tightened up where they become competitive, and they'll start eating stuff they typically wouldn't eat.
I love that, right? It's if you create enough hunger and competition, they're gonna plow through for you.
Well, well, they're not really hungry because I'm not forcing them to be hungry. It's just a competitive issue. Um, it's just, they're beside their buddies and they don't want their buddy to get something that they can possibly have.
Well, so you're using that animal's habit for your favor. So I appreciate
Hmm.
what you've learned to do as over these years. And of course, we still have so much to learn from you. So we're looking forward to your visit next week.
Yep,
And
it's gonna be fun.
we're gonna make an effort, and we welcome everyone, to, share some feedback via email. You all have my email if there's anything we missed or anything
Yeah,
we differently or that you think needs to be addressed next week. We're open to that kind of feedback. It's a two-way street here. This is how the stewardship trials roll. So please do that. Don't hesitate if something comes to mind. Russ shared a lot of information here.
yeah. Um, yeah, I was just going through the questions here. I wanted to hit a couple. Um, iPhone, he's got grazing alfalfas. It's thrived for many years. And it's green during drought. And the reason the alfalfa is green through drought is it's got a really deep root system. I've seen where they've dug 25 feet deep to dig up tap roots from alfalfa. However, be careful with alfalfa whenever it's drought out because it can have nitrate, can be high in nitrates.
Yeah,
Okay.
lost of it, right?
And Robert's asking if it's run off a hydrant. That I'm assuming that's the 10-acre pasture thing. You can run it off a hydrant, off the pressure tank, whatever.
Good. All right, we are
I think that
over, so we want to make sure we, I don't quite know what the limit is for our YouTube, but I know that we were supposed to stick to 90, so the last half of this might not be, the last might be cut off, but I'll leave that to NOFA's mix masters and editors. We do want to make sure that this resource is shared again and again so that, you know, people could revisit shared here and
and
appreciate.
I encourage everybody that's here, if you're coming to the pasture walk on the 8th next Tuesday, please bring your questions. If there's some questions that have come up, and I'm sure there'll be questions that come up from the presentation here tonight, make sure you write them down and bring them along with you. I want to answer everybody's questions.
Absolutely. And will this slide presentation be available to the participants?
Oh yeah, most definitely. You have the PDF, so just contact Christina and she'll make sure that you get the PowerPoint.
Yeah, and we'll be setting up you know, the sort of schedule for the day, and we'll be taking all this feedback you've given us into account. So we'll weave that into what we're going to be walking and talking this a week from now. So really thank you all for your feedback and your questions. And Russ, thanks again. This was very informative, and as always, it leads us to more questions, which is a good sign. Take care, everybody. Have a good night.